The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those in the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights. I'm Bethany Ricciardi, joined here today with Barbara France, the Executive Director of Community Foundation for Northeast Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Barbara.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. So today we're here to talk a little bit about what it means not to have a will. Now, when musician Prince died, headlines were full of, all the stories and the involvement that he had in charitable donations, but without a will, really no one knew what to do with his estate. So I guess, could you maybe talk a little bit about what the Community Foundation does in a sense of directing people to have a will?
Well, we talk to a lot of people in different positions where they're ready to make a gift, or they're thinking about making a gift, or they're just trying to figure out what they want to do with their estate. And we always encourage them to make sure that they have a will or something in place. To go back to the example of Prince, he may have done wonderful things during his lifetime, but all of that will end now because none of his family is going to continue to do that. They're going to fight over those assets. And I explain to donors when I'm talking to them that you really have two choices. You can establish a will where you can decide what's going to happen, or you can leave it up to the government because they will take care of it for you. And if you don't want the government to do that, then you just have to take a few minutes and take care of it yourself. It's not a big job. A will is a relatively inexpensive thing to have an attorney help you with. I think you can even go online and get will kits. I don't know that for sure, but if you have questions, you should sit down with a professional advisor, and that's what we encourage donors to do.
So if Prince did have a will, how do you think the process of being able to make those charitable donations would have played out compared to now?
Well, what happens when you have a will is it's a legal document that says what is supposed to happen. So let's say he would have said something like, I want 50% of my assets to go to my family, and then you list who's the family. And the other 50% can go to this charity or this list of charities. And you can even say to be used for specific purposes. You can designate exactly what's going to happen. I help people to understand that you've worked all your life to build these assets.
Right.
And if you're thinking about a charitable gift, you better write it down and make it, put it into a legal document, or it's never going to happen, and then somebody else is going to make decisions about the money that you worked all your life to build.
So from your experience, what are some of the things that either an individual or a couple should be thinking about when going in to draft a will?
Well, first of all, you need to think about what kinds, are you considering a charitable gift as part of your estate? Do you want it to be all of your estate? Do you want part of your assets to go to family or to friends or whomever, and part of it to go to charitable purposes? So you need to really think about what are the things that you've been passionate about during your lifetime. Has there been a church that you've been involved with? College that you attended, maybe a kids' summer camp that made such a difference in your life and your kids' life and your grandkids' life. It would be nice to support that. Think about the things that are important to you, and then decide how you want to divvy up your assets after you're gone. And once you've got that done, you don't have to think about it again. On the other hand, if you decide you want to make some changes, you can do that. Most wills or trusts are revocable, which means you can change them. You can take it back and change it. And so you can make these decisions, and then if something happens later, you can do what you want to do to make the changes.
Is there a more common way where you find people making charitable donations through an estate or a will? Is there any pattern that you find?
Well, a will, like as I said earlier, a will is a very simple document. It doesn't need to be a long, involved, expensive document. A trust is a little bit different, and they are a little more expensive to have those drawn up. You definitely need an attorney to do a trust. A will is much less involved, and you just can name. We've had people that set up a will that said there was one gentleman, Barney Kantak, who cleaned septic tanks during his lifetime and worked hard, but he was never married, never had children, and when he passed away, he left a will that left his assets to the Community Foundation. And he chose 5 agencies that would be the beneficiaries. So you just have to think about what's important to you, write it down, and then sit down and talk to a professional advisor and have them help you put it together. Or if you're computer savvy and you can go to LegalZoom or one of those kind of places, and they have will kits that you can do. If you have any questions, though, you definitely need to work with a professional advisor, an attorney, or someone that has knowledge of what you're trying to accomplish.
Great. Well, thanks, Barb. It definitely sounds like getting a will is the best choice.
Definitely,
Awesome.
definitely.
We're going to go ahead and take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll be meeting with a retired professor from Western Michigan University to speak about his and his wife's will. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. I'm here today with Carl Woloschuk. Thank you so much for being with us. So you are a member of the Community Foundation Legacy Society, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. So when did you and your wife decide to make a will?
Well, experts advise that you establish a will and can establish a will at any age, but we, like many young couples and young people, waited. We were in our mid-40s before we did that. As many young people, you're busy building a career, you're interested in completing your own education, you're working on the education of your children. So we really delayed that, and after deaths of few close relatives, grandparents and parents, we realized that we needed to have a financial plan. And after the children completed college, we realized that it was a time to do it. And there's some advantages to doing a will, and the primary reason is that you have a plan for the distribution of your financial assets. And you also can develop a plan should you encounter an illness or an accident as you age. You can establish patient advocates, for example. We establish our will as part of a trust, and that allows us to avoid the probate process, which is required by wills. There's costs, and it has to be administered if you solely have a will. The trust also gives us a plan to manage our assets after our demise. So there are some advantages to having a will because you have plans identified, but the trust also gives you a way to manage it after you're and avoid the scrutiny of having everything, public.
Did you find that you were able to include charitable donations and things like that?
Yes, and having a will allows you to do that, and the trust it gives you a method to distribute it.
Was that an important part when you set out? Do you mind if I ask what you guys chose to do?
Well, we decided to have a will as part of a revocable living trust.
Okay. So when you decided to share your plans with the Community Foundation, how did that kind of play out? What does that look like?
Well, we've always, my wife and I have always given to charitable organizations that support our beliefs, our values, and our goals, and we've always contributed to institutions that aided us in our personal and career development along the way. And in addition, we wanted to return to the community benefits that we had received in terms of income earned, friendships developed, recreational and entertainment opportunities that were provided us during our lifetime. And I defined community to be broader than just a geographic location. And so we were looking at also professional commitment. We were looking at special interests that we had in addition to the geographical area.
And you're a Rogers City resident, right?
We live in Rogers City, yes.
So what were some of the things, maybe some of the obstacles or anything like that when you were going through this process that, you know, maybe stuck out for you? Any advice for someone going through making a will?
Well, I think realistically the biggest, I read somewhere that 60% of the people never bothered to even establish a will,
Wow.
let alone a trust.
Yeah.
I think the biggest obstacle for me personally was coming to the point where you realize that you know, life is not eternal.
Mm-hmm.
That and that you need to have a plan for after you pass. Recognizing the need to do that and thinking about post-death planning are difficult obstacles. But once you get over that, then you need to, advice that I would say is you need to develop it in concert with your spouse if you're married and your family, and then also consult an attorney to make sure that it's done the way you want and the wishes are honored in the way you want.
So just a side note, do your wife and you have the same will? Is there one document, or how does that work?
Well, we have, they're part, the will and testament are part of the trust, but we got consensus in terms of what we wanted to do with our distribution. What we've done is try to support churches, universities. I'm a former professor at Western Michigan University, so I gave part of my estate to establish a graduate scholarship at Western. My wife was a teacher at Rogers City High School, so we established a joint scholarship for Rogers City graduates.
That's great.
So, and a lot of people do that. They designate a specific geographical area, or in my case, I wanted to support the institution that I had graduated and worked at. So it's up to you, and you can have multiple variations of that. You can give to a professional group, you can give it to an institution, churches, or in our case, we gave to the foundation.
Did you find yourself, because I know you said you started doing this in your early 40s, have you made changes along the way?
Yes, and that's an important thing to have the viewers recognize, that once you establish a will or trust, you should periodically review it for changes as we get older and situations may change over time. It's important to have a periodic review of what you've done in the past and change it if changes are needed.
Were you being able to find guidance along this with professional help, or was it more, were you guys able to figure everything out on your own?
Well, you have some sense, I think, when you develop a will, what you want to have happen to your assets, after your demise. But it certainly helps to have an attorney's opinion as to the distribution of it. Some things I would recommend for people considering a will is that there's certain steps that you have to go through. You have to identify how do you define community? Is it a geographical area? Is it support for an institution like your alumni of the University of Michigan? You want to give to that. Do you have a professional interest in maybe a general area like education or wildlife or recreation? And then lastly, does it support things that you believe in. You know, my wife and I are both educators, so we set up a scholarship to benefit young people.
Right.
And then another thing is determine, do you want to have it designated for a specific purpose, or do you want to give it as an unrestricted gift to the foundation, to have the board determine how they would like the money used. Then establish your guidelines so that they're broad enough so that it's really used. Sometimes people make it so narrow. Maybe they were in radiology and they want to give a scholarship for radiology students. Well, maybe to make it broader and say health occupation as a whole. Because when you're giving something, you want the money to be used. And sometimes if you restrict it to too small degree, you'll never have an opportunity to benefit someone. And then also how you build it. You can give a gift as part of your will after your demise, a memorial gift, or you can give money while you're living and build on it over time. We took the route where we were going to establish money at the beginning so we could see the recipients of our scholarship. That was important for me.
That's
because
great.
Working at the university, oftentimes we had people give grants for students and awards to students, but they had already passed and the students never got a chance to meet them. So it was important to do that. And then lastly, you want to work closely with the foundation staff to make sure your wishes, just like when you work with the attorney to establish your will, make sure that the wishes are going to be, and the procedures are going to be appropriate.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Carl. I'm sure it must give you a sense of peace knowing that you have that will all set up.
Well, thank you, Bethany.
Yeah, thanks again
Appreciate
for being
it.
here.
Thank you.
We're going to take another quick commercial break, but when we come back, we'll be here with Laura Green, an Alpena-based lawyer, and she's going to talk a little bit about the process of creating a will. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We've been here talking about the importance of having a will, and right now Laura Green, an Alpena-based attorney, is here to join us. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So can you talk a little bit about when you advise people to create a will?
Certainly. Wills are sometimes the last thing people want to think about because it's not a pleasant subject.
It can be
usually.
scary.
It's scary, so it kind of becomes the last thing on a priority list. But typically when you start accumulating assets, you want to start thinking about establishing an estate plan. There's a few triggers, there's a lot of triggers you can look at, but there's about 5 I consider when you start thinking about when do you begin planning.
Okay.
So marriage, and with that is divorce and oftentimes remarriage. You want to start thinking about your estate plan because your beneficiaries change. All of a sudden you have a spouse who you may want to receive your assets versus other family members. When you have children or grandchildren, that's another triggering event because you want to plan for their future, their college education, their guardians, who might be their guardian if you were to die while they're still minors. When you start a business, you need to think about succession planning and what you want to do with your business upon your death. When you buy a home, or a cottage or a camp, which happens a lot here, you want to start thinking about estate planning because that's an example that you're starting to accumulate assets. And as you accumulate assets, you want to be able to control who receives those on your death. And finally, another big trigger is when someone else you know dies or you have a health scare. Typically then you start thinking maybe something's going to happen to me and you start planning for your future of your family and your children.
So we've been referencing Prince's situation throughout this whole segment, and do you find that locally there's people who fall into the same type of conflict?
I do. Unfortunately, statistically, about 55% of the population does not draft a will or estate plan. So it's a big number, and as a result, 55% of deaths result in someone else deciding what happens to your estate. So for Prince, for example, he died supposedly without a will or a trust, and he had no wife or children. So he has a sister and half siblings that are going to be disputing his estate. He also has probably countless record deals and contracts, and they're all going to be filing claims. So it gets really messy. The other sad thing about Prince's death is that it was reported he wanted to donate his house or create a museum out of his house. And he didn't put it in writing, it's not going to become a museum.
So what kind of happens to, individuals, couples, what happens to their assets if there's no will?
Upon their death, many things can happen. If you have a spouse and children, probably the majority of your estate would go to them.
Okay.
But in some situations, you might not have a spouse, or you may have children from a separate relationship. And so how that gets divided becomes a decision of the state. There's certain formulas that are used to determine who gets what. If you leave no children and no spouse, then it might be your parents or your siblings. There was a man in New York, this is a big example, but he was a Holocaust survivor and he had a $40 million estate. He had no children. His wife died before he did. He had no siblings, no nieces, no nephews.
Oh my goodness.
Nobody can find a beneficiary. So eventually, that $40 million might go to the state of New York, where he could have done a multitude of things if he had thought about charities or other organizations to give to.
So is it expensive to create a will? Is it complicated? I mean, what are maybe some of the things that set people back from doing it?
I don't know if it's the cost, because really there should be no cost deterrent. Really, it's so beneficial to have one that you should be able to find a way to afford it. Especially if you have fewer assets, you would need a simpler will, and that would maybe be a few $100s, versus someone with a more complicated estate may need a trust or multiple trusts, and that might be several $1,000s. So it just varies depending on what your needs are, but they're not complicated. The thing that you have to provide is all of your assets. So a lot of assets don't pass through a will. You have retirement assets that sometimes you name a beneficiary to, or you have a spouse that's the beneficiary to it. Another sad example, I think it's my last one, but it was where this man remarried. He had children from a prior relationship, and his goal was to have them receive all of his assets. And he died 2 months after his marriage. So unfortunately, he had most of his asset was his retirement, his 401k. But unfortunately, he did not have his wife sign off on her marital rights to that 401k, and she was entitled to all of it. So though he wanted his children to receive his estate, his wife from the second marriage received it. So you don't always get what you want unless you go in and say, here's everything I have and here's what I'd like to see happen.
So do you usually bring up charitable contributions with clients when they're trying to figure out maybe what to do with their assets?
I do, because many people forget about that. Our community, I think especially, is very generous and very giving. Many people are out there on various boards, they're giving money, they're giving their time, but they forget that they can continue that legacy in death if they provide for that charity through their will or a trust.
So do you think that people should find guidance in making a will, maybe an attorney's office, the community foundation, different places like that?
Definitely. You have to have some guidance. There are internet forms out there. There's wills that you can write yourself. But even if you do that, you should probably have someone oversee it, because that's not your entire plan. You still have retirement to think about, and jointly owned assets that pass outside of a will or a trust. So to set it up correctly, you should have somebody at least review it or talk to you about it.
And really quick, just a final question, going back to charitable contributions, are there certain types of assets that people should focus on charity, or is it just specifically money, things like that?
There can be, depending on how much you have. So some people might say, I'm going to give a percentage of what I own or a certain dollar amount. Others will start thinking about, what can I do to provide a better tax benefit? So retirement assets are a good way to think about donating to a charity, because they get those assets 100% tax exempt, where your family members might have to pay a tax on that if they receive it. So it may make sense to give a portion of your retirement to the charitable organization, and the other assets that your children don't have to pay taxes on to the children. So there are things you can do with that. Appreciated property, real estate that you might have bought at $20,000 20 years ago might be worth $100,000 now. And when it's sold, there might be a capital gains tax to deal with. If you were looking to get rid of that, you might want to include a charity in that.
All right, well, thank you so much, Laura, especially for bringing the attorney perspective onto it. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Awesome, and thank you so much from everybody at home. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to tune in next week for another Insight segment.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.
The furniture and set design for this episode of Insights is provided by Young Appliance Art Van Furniture on US 23 South, Alpena.